So in the previous section, we talked about how these pigments are able to absorb the solar energy, right? So now that we're able to absorb all the solar energy, now what? So let's move on to the next part, which is the light reaction of photosynthesis. So as you're going through this section, I want you to think about how does ATP get synthesized? What role does NADPH have, and how does it get made? And then lastly, when does oxygen get released? Like where does oxygen play a role here, and when does it get released? So just think about those questions. Okay, so let's kind of look at the overview, and then we can kind of go a little bit more into details, right? So remember that this is all taking place on both the thyroid membrane as well as the stroma, right? So if you kind of recall, we have the membrane of the thylakoid. It is found on the chloroplast. That's where all these chlorophylls are found, and they're absorbing that sun energy. So now that we have all the sun energy that's being absorbed, what do we do with that? Well, there's a lot of energy in that. So in the thylakoid membrane, you have these photosystems, which are these proteins, and these proteins can actually accept the electrons and also release the electron. They can donate the electron to the next acceptor, right? So when you have the solar energy that's really excited come in, it's going to hit the first photosystem that it hits is this called photosystem 2. And I know it sounds a little weird as photosystem 2, not photosystem 1. This has to do with when they were discovered, so don't think about it too much. So photosystem 2 is the first one to hit. So you have the solar energy is able to go and hit onto the photosystem 2, which has these electrons that are like full of energy, and they get excited. So these electrons get excited from that solar energy passing some of its energy to electron. So the electron is going to get excited, and you can kind of see it here. It gets excited and it moves up, and it's going to go to the next electron acceptor, which will be the electron transport chain. So before we go into that, let's think about where did this electron originally come from? Well, this electron here in photosystem 2, which also contains the pigment, right? That's why we have them all green here. This electron right here will come from water splitting. So this is a process called, let's see if I can write it here, photolysis. So when you lyse something, you're kind of breaking it apart. So what's happening is that the water that is passed through into the chlorophyll is going to get split. And when that water gets split, it gets split into hydrogen ions as well as oxygen and electrons. And this electron is going to reside in photosystem 2 until it gets excited by the solar energy. Once it gets excited, it reaches another energy level and it goes on to the next electron acceptor. This electron acceptor is found in the electron transport chain and will eventually be passed on to photosystem 1. In photosystem 1, we're also able to harness some of that solar energy to excite electrons. So here's the electron that comes from photosystem 2. It gets passed on to photosystem 1. The electrons get excited, and it will also go to an electron acceptor and get passed on to the next electron acceptor, which in this case is going to be NADP. Sorry, I had to erase some of the other picture because my head was getting in the way. But this is the next electron acceptor, and this will accept the electron and a hydrogen ion, and in the process get reduced down to NADP H, and this is going to play a role when we get to the Calvin cycle. So let's just kind of revisit the photosystems in a little bit more detail before we move on to the Calvin cycle. So photosystem 2, as I mentioned, is the first one to be involved. And again, we talked about how the electron comes from splitting of the water, right? The photolysis. This is occurring in the thyroid membrane. Just recall that this is in the thyroid membrane. So the thyroid space within that membrane is gonna, each time the water is split, we're going to end up with these hydrogen ions. And we care about these hydrogen ions. These will play a role in a little bit. So each time the water split is going to release some hydrogen ion into the thylakoid space, right? Additionally, it's going to release oxygen and it's going to release electrons. So if you recall, electron is now here in photosystem 2. And so solar energy is going to take that energy, is going to excite the electron. The electron is then passed to a photoacceptor, right? And then we're going to also have hydrogen ions and oxygen ions being released into the system. Saw that the electron is going to get passed over to the electron transport chain, right? So here is the thylakoid membrane. So this is a nice image that kind of shows you here. Here are the chloroplasts and thylakoid, and this is the membrane right here. So as we mentioned, water is going to be split into hydrogen ions and oxygen ion, and that electron is going to be excited and it's going to pass through. So electron is excited, it's going to get passed through all of these other electron acceptor that can accept the electron. So the electron transport chain is made of a bunch of proteins that can accept and donate electron. So imagine an analogy would be like a hot potato, right? So we're playing hot potato. The potato is super hot, has so much heat in it. Someone's going to give me high energy. I'm going to pass it on to the next person. Each time that I pass it on, each time the potato is passed on, it loses some of that energy, right? It loses some of that heat and is not as hot as it was when it first came in. So you can kind of think of this similarity is that electron is full of energy from the sun. But each time that we pass it down to the electron acceptor, it loses some of that energy because it's going to use that energy in order to pump hydrogen ions. It's going to be able to pump hydrogen ions. Why is my pen not showing? Hydrogen ion through and pump it into the thylakoid space. So it's going to pump it from the stroma into the thylakoid space. And why does it do this? As we're doing this, we're actually forming what's called a proton gradient. So we're basically pushing a lot of hydrogen ion. So we have this buildup of hydrogen ion. And remember that when we're talking about kind of how there's a buildup of a certain ion, that it kind of wants to move to an area where there's not as many. So, right? So we tend to, just like humans, when we're sitting on the bus, we tend to not want to sit next to someone, a stranger. We tend to want to space ourselves out. You can kind of imagine that ions are very similar in that if there's too much hydrogen ions here, the ions don't like it. They kind of want to move where there's a little more space and disperse for them. So they actually want to move out from the thylakoid space back into the stroma. So they actually want to move that way. So we're actually establishing this hydrogen gradient, which results in a lot of potential energy, right? So as we're getting all this potential energy, what's going to happen is we end up with this difference in the amount of ions, and in this energy, all this potential energy is going to actually be used to drive ATP synthase, which is another protein that's part of this whole electron transfer chain. So this potential energy is going to be used to push that hydrogen ion across, and that potential energy is going to be used to convert into producing ATP. So we're going to take all this potential energy, and that energy is actually going to be used to synthesize ATP by adding a phosphate to ADP. So the goal of this electron transfer chain is to take the electrons, excite them, but via the sun, excite the electrons so that there's a lot of energy, and pass that energy along the chain so that eventually, as the energy is being passed, we're forming this proton gradient right here. We're forming this buildup of protons in here, and the energy is being passed, and this buildup of proton is going to form a proton gradient, which has a large amount of potential energy that can then be used to push through the ATP synthase, which is another protein complex, and actually in order for it to form ATP by taking the energy of pushing through all this hydrogen ion, like, right? Because this ATP synthesis, as you can imagine, there's so much potential energy in hydrogen as it's being pushed through. This ATP synthesis actually spins really fast. So it's taking all that potential energy, converting it to kinetic energy, and it's going to take that energy to then add that phosphate group onto ADP, and we're going to make ATP with it. So the goal of all of this with regards to water and with regards to solar energy right here is to try to make ATP. And so we're going to make ATP by exciting electrons that can then be used and passed to other electron acceptors. So here's a up-close version of ATP synthase. It's not really pretty picture, but it's one that I found, and I feel like it kind of explains that there's a lot, you can see there's a lot of buildup of hydrogen ions, right, in the thyroid space. All this hydrogen ions. So the hydrogens are like, get me out of here, I need space, and it wants to be pushed into the stroma. So all that potential energy is building up. It's going to make it so that the hydrogen are going to be driven to want to be pushed through this ATP synthesis. And as the ATP synthesis is spinning and all this energy is there, that energy is going to be used to then allow ADP to add on to phosphate, and then we have ATP. And this is kind of the end goal, is to form this ATP. Okay, so let's kind of first, let's think about this a little bit more. Let's kind of break down so we're all capturing everything, right? So ATP synthase complex, where did we find that? So we're going to find that on the thyroid membrane, right? It's going to be part of this whole electron transport chain, which includes photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. And these photosystems are the thing that contains the pigment. So sun energy is going to be absorbed by the pigment. And then the pigment is found in the photosystem. Solar energy is going to be used to excite electrons. And where did electrons originally come from? The electrons are originally found when water is being lysed into hydrogen ions and electrons and oxygen. So where do we find these hydrogen ions? What a hydrogen ion, as the water is being split, is going to be we're going to find them actually in the space. They're also being pumped in from the stroma. So we have this buildup of hydrogen ions, right? This buildup of hydrogen ions results in this establishment of the proton gradient. Why do we care about the proton gradient? Well, that proton gradient is important because there's just so much potential energy there. So because there's so many proton ions in the thyroid space, what happens when we have a lot of potential energy, because the protons want to leave the thyroid space and go back into the stroma. There's just too many ions in these breathing room, so it wants to leave and go into the stroma space. So the stroma is, as it's being pushed through the ATP synthase in order to actually go into the stroma, all the energy is being harnessed, and the energy is going to be used to make ADP and phosphate into ATP. All right. So this is pretty much the goal of the light reaction itself, is to be able to harness that solar energy so that it will eventually be able to be converted into ATP, which is an energy source that the cells can use. Let's revisit these 3 questions that we had asked in the beginning of the section. So I'm hoping that as we walk through this section of the lecture, that you were able to answer these 3 questions of where does ATP get made, where does NADPH get made, and then how's oxygen released? When does oxygen get released, and where does the oxygen even come from? So here are my answers. So check them and see whether or not they match with yours. In the next section, we're going to talk about the last part of this photosynthesis reaction, which is the carbon cycle.